Good evening. Welcome to our 2018 Election Forum series on WEFS and at FloridaToday.com. I'm Isadora Rangel, Florida Today's engagement editor and your host for the evening. Tonight, we're going to be hosting our last forum, and it will feature the two candidates running to represent Congressional District 8. It covers Brevard County, Indian River County, and part of Orange County. The two candidates on stage with me tonight are Republican Congressman Bill Posey and his Democratic challenger, Sanjay Patel. Mr. Posey and Mr. Patel will each have 1 minute to answer my questions, as well as 1 minute for their opening and closing statements. They also get a 30-second rebuttal if their opponent brings them up. And a reminder that rebuttals will not be allowed in the opening and closing statements. Our forum series is a partnership between Florida Today, Eastern Florida State College, and the League of Women Voters of the Space Coast. And before we begin, a reminder that election date is on November 6th. So without further ado, we're going to begin with our opening statements. Mr. Patel, you're going first, and you have 1 minute.
My name is Sanjay Patel, and I'm running to represent you in Congress. Thank you to the Florida Today, Eastern Florida State College, and the League of Women Voters for hosting this tonight. I'm a first-generation immigrant to this country whose family came here with nothing. I earned a degree in economics and built my own small business managing technology projects. In many ways, my life is the story of the American dream. I'm running to make sure that dream stays alive here on the Space and Treasure Coast. Right now, our elected officials are not listening to or representing us. We deserve real representation in this district. Healthcare, we should have healthcare as a human right in this country. Every kid should be able to go to college or trade school without a lifetime of debt. We should be able to make sure hardworking people earn livable wages, and we should protect our lagoon and our environment. I'm running to make sure that that dream remains alive here on the Space Coast. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Posey.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm Bill Posey, and I decided to run for Congress as a father and a grandfather because I didn't like the direction in which our country was headed. We've managed to have some change since then in the right direction, but there's still an awful lot that needs to be done. Currently, we're blessed to have the strongest economy in many years. We have more jobs available than we have people looking for jobs. It's the lowest unemployment rate in the past 30 years, and it adds economic value to every single person in the workforce. I've always tried to represent you like I would expect you to represent me if you were my congressperson. That's why I always give back to Raise Pass before I was even elected to Congress every single year. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to begin with our top local issue, which is the Indian River Lagoon. And the question is, the degradation of the lagoon has continued despite changes in government and which party is in power. Name at least one thing Congress has failed to do about this issue, and what can one congressman out of 435 realistically do about cleaning up the lagoon? Mr. Posey, you're going first.
Well, one congressman out of 435 can start a bipartisan estuary conference, understanding that there's strength in numbers. We have 28 estuaries in the United States, and so we've got over 40 members in the estuary conference, which is almost 10% of the Congress. That helps us all advocate together for the lagoon. Personally, I have reauthorized the National Estuary Funding Fund that was zeroed out in the administration's budget this year. I increased the amount of base funding for the NEP, dedicated money, passed legislation dedicated to further algae bloom research, and have the remainder used for grants for estuaries with critical needs.
Mr. Patel?
Our proposed environmental policies couldn't be more divergent. I support restoration of our lagoon and a Green New Deal, whereby we convert our infrastructure to renewable and sustainable energy, while my opponent is a climate change denier. You know, even after the recent fish kills that we had in 2016, my opponent voted to let pesticides be sprayed directly into our waterways without EPA review or Clean Water Acts. He also there was a boat ramp on Oslo Road that he wanted to allow to happen that would have destroyed one of the best seagrass beds down in Vero Beach. It would have harmed manatees, fish nurseries. So my opponent, when he talks about the environment, he has a 5% lifetime rating with the League of Conservation Voters. We need real representation that will actually fight for environment, and that's what I intend to do.
Mr. Posey, you have 30
rebuttal,
seconds.
My name was mentioned. The charge has been leveled many times by my opponent that I'm a climate change denier. That's a lie. I mean, that's just not a distortion, that's an absolute lie. I don't know anybody that doesn't believe in climate change. We do have climate change, it's a fact of life. During the Zika virus scare, there was a fear that we would have a Zika outbreak here, Zika virus outbreak here. And so we allowed the use of one of the minor pesticides on the do not use list to make sure that we didn't have any women in Brevard County giving birth to babies with microencephalitis.
Can I respond, because there
Sorry,
was misinformation there?
Let's keep going. We'll make sure that we get to that later. Otherwise, we'll be on the back and forth the entire evening.
Someone should fact check that, though.
So we have Florida Today here. So that's one more job for Mr. Dave Berman, who's covering the forum tonight. Let's move on to immigration. There's a caravan of Central American migrants tracking across the Mexico border with the U.S. So my question is, do you agree with President Trump's policy of separating children from their parents at the border? If you disagreed, what should the federal government do with these families? Mr. Patel?
So 100%, I absolutely disagree with that kind of policy. Look, we need comprehensive immigration reform in this country. And for too long, Congress has shirked its responsibility to take action on this matter. Look, we have to protect Americans, but we have to also make sure that we protect what it means to be an American. Right now, our immigration system violates those fundamental values. When we talk about the dreamers or kids being torn apart from their parents, that system is out of step with our values. What we need to do is make sure that folks who are coming to this country, that we don't persecute families who are desperate, that we make sure that there are safe pathways for folks seeking legal status, for asylum seekers. I intend to make sure that as soon as I get in there, we need to make sure we address immigration reform.
Mr. Posey, do you agree with the Trump policy of separating children and their families?
No, I don't think you should separate children from their parents. And one of the problems, if you talk to the people at the border that they were having, was ascertaining that the children were actually belonging to the adults who claimed to be their parents. There's a lot of trafficking that goes on down there, and that's a common way to traffic young children. I believe that we should have a pathway for children who are in this country because of no fault of their own, and I have support legislation that would give them permission to stay here while they pursued that, so long as they did not commit a crime or go on welfare.
Thank you. Still on the topic of immigration, if you could write an immigration reform bill, what would you do to address these three issues? Number one, the more than 11 million immigrants in the country illegally. Number two, dreamers who were brought to the country illegally as children. And number three, whether U.S. citizens should continue to be allowed to sponsor green cards for their parents and siblings. That's often referred to as chain migration. Mr. Posey, you're going first. What would that bill entail?
Well, we must have a number of things to have actual good immigration reform. A lot of people talk about it, but they don't really get into specifics. But we must have operational control over the border. We must end the visa lottery, which we know has brought in murders in our country. People that are unvetted are allowed over 50,000 a year here. We should aim on unlimited chain migration because a majority of those people end up on welfare in this country, studies have shown. The children who are brought here through no fault of their own, as I mentioned earlier, should have the opportunity to get in line behind people who are playing by the rules, and we should allow them to stay here as long as they don't commit the two offenses that I mentioned until they can achieve their citizenship.
Mr. Patel?
My opponent stokes fear of immigrant communities. When you think of an immigrant, I want you to think of me. The majority of folks who are coming to this country are in search of a better future for their families or escaping undescribable violence. For the dreamers, who know no other home in this country, we should make sure that they have a pathway to citizenship. For the families that are here, you know, in some cases they're waiting 15, 20 years to be reunited with their families. We have to make sure that there are pathways for them to reunite with their families. Any immigration policy that we follow must be reflective of our values. And when my opponent talks about them coming over to commit crimes and to live off of welfare, I have to remind my opponent that the majority of folks coming here are paying taxes, and if they're not here with legal documents, they're actually ineligible to collect any kind of welfare.
Mr. Posey, you have 30 seconds for a rebuttal.
There's a strange misconception, and I was under that impression at one time too, that most of the people that cross our southern border are coming here to work and achieve a better way of life. Until I went to the border and I saw the drug trafficking, I saw the human trafficking, I saw the guns that crossed our border, I saw that the drug cartels control all the border towns. We must secure the United States of America from that.
Thank you. How about Trump's proposal for a border wall? Mexico has said that it's not going to pay for it. You've probably heard the recent reports that the federal budget deficit has swelled to $779 billion in fiscal year 2018. Do you support the border wall, and do you think the U.S. can pay for it? Mr. Posey, I believe you're going first.
Am I first?
I believe so, yes.
Absolutely, I support a border wall or anything else that would give us operational control over the border for the reasons that I told you. There's a threat from the drug cartels. There's a threat from the human traffickers. Most of the border cities, even on our side of the border now, are controlled by the drug cartels. The penalties for ratting on any of them or telling on any of them that do the crimes there are horrific, and I actually can't say in mixed company what they do to people who they catch telling the police about their illicit activities. And the threat is that that cancer will spread across the United States of America. I remember a time we didn't have any drive-by shootings in Brevard County. They had them in South Florida every day, but we didn't have any. But it wasn't long before the drive-bys progressed their way to Brevard County. The sweetness of Brevard County did not permeate the areas where they were having the drive-by. And that's the fear. We have to protect our country.
And how can the U.S. pay for the project? And how? Mr. Posey?
I'm having a hard time hearing you behind this.
Oh, sorry. I'll try to speak into my mic. Just a part of the question was, how can the U.S. pay for a border wall if Mexico says it won't pay for it?
Well, actually, I'm a sponsor of a bill that would allow people to donate for the wall if Congress won't man up and do what's necessary.
All right. I'm going to ask everyone. It was part of the rules, so please keep it quiet. Respect the two
you
candidates
have to remember,
on stage.
Twice previously, Congress has said we needed to secure that border, and twice the administration failed to do it. Now we have an administration that's actually keeping their promises and trying to do that.
Thank you. Mr. Propel, just to repeat the question, is do you support Trump's border wall proposal? How can the U.S. pay for it?
No, I don't support a border wall, and my opponent needs to stop this fear-mongering. It's ridiculous.
All right.
We don't have a border.
Please, no, I'm sorry, Mr. Patel. Please, I understand emotions are very high right now. I will ask that you respect the two gentlemen on stage. It takes a lot to be up here, so please be respectful of the rules.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Patel, please continue.
Instead of spending billions on a wall, why don't we take that money and fix our Indian River Lagoon and make sure that every American has health care?
All right, Mr. Posey, he brought you up. Would you like a 30-second rebuttal?
No, that's ridiculous.
Okay. All right, so moving on to health care. Mr. Patel, you are a proponent of Medicare for All. A recent study by a think tank affiliated with the conservative group Koch brothers found that the plan would increase federal spending by $32 trillion over a 10-year period. The study also found that the single-payer health care plan would save Americans $2 trillion. Even if you take the savings into consideration, there's still a $30 trillion increase. And considering our growing federal deficit, how can the U.S. pay for this?
So we spend more on health care than any other country on the planet, yet we have the lowest life expectancy, and the highest infant mortality rates among similar countries. Right now, in our district alone, we have nearly 100,000 people don't have any health insurance. And many thousands more can't afford their monthly deductibles, prescriptions, or their premiums. I can't tell you how many folks I've met who have gone bankrupt trying to take care of themselves or their loved ones while they're sick. It's time that we make healthcare a human right in this country, and I'm supporting Medicare for all. Not only is it the right thing to do, that same study that you refer, right now we spend so much more on healthcare towards administration, advertising. We're not able to negotiate drug prices. We can actually cover every American, make sure they all have coverage. Not only is it the right thing to do, we would actually save money.
But can you answer my specific question, which was how can the U.S. pay for this? Your opponent, I'm sure, will say that this isn't feasible. How can the country pay for this given our growing national deficit?
So one, by moving towards a Medicare for all system, we would be able to negotiate services and prices for drugs. In terms of the deficit, right now my opponent passed a $2 trillion tax cut to the wealthiest 1% on the planet. I think that's where we should start. Let's make sure we don't send that money, that welfare, to the wealthiest 1% and focus on using those resources to services that actually benefit the majority of Americans.
Mr. Posey, your thoughts on Medicare for all?
Well, Medicare for all would destroy the Medicare system that we have now that people have always grown to rely on. When you have complete control, government control of health care, it always leads to rationing. It does in every country that has it. If I was a Canadian, I would be dead now. I'm a cancer survivor, and they would not have allowed me to have the testing for the diagnosis, much less the treatment, to cure my cancer. That's what happens when you have government-controlled health care. It always ends up in a rationing, which is obviously not what people bargained for when they went into it, but that's what they end up with.
We're already rationing healthcare because 100,000 people don't have healthcare in our district.
All right.
Okay,
it's
funny.
We're going to be nice to each other. I'm sorry. I understand. We're going to be nice because this is for the voters. So let's try to be courteous to each other.
He got a couple extra words in there, and I'd just like to say, I hear this 100,000 people without coverage in every congressional district in Florida. That's merely a progressive talking point. It's impossible for every district in Florida to have 100,000 exact number uninsured people.
2.6 million Floridians don't have health care.
All right, so moving on, Mr. Posey, I have a question for you now. You voted for a bill to replace the Affordable Care Act in 2017. The American Health Care Act would reduce federal deficits by $119 billion over the coming decade. It would also increase the number of people who are uninsured by 23 million by 2026. Why did you vote for this bill?
What is the last part of the question? Is what?
This bill would also increase the number of people who are uninsured by 23 million in 2026, and those figures are from the Congressional Budget Office. My question is, why did you vote for this bill?
The question is?
Why did you vote for it?
For a number of reasons. When we look at the uninsured, we just don't look at people who cannot afford to have insurance. Since Obamacare, a huge number of the uninsured people are people who were previously insured. But you remember the lies. You can keep your insurance company if you want to. You can keep your own doctor if you want to. The cost will be less, and there'll be no rationing. All based on lies, and people found that out. People who work hard and play by the rules found out that their premiums doubled. Their deductibles tripled, and their copays quadrupled in some cases. And that's about the average that we heard from our constituents when we asked them to tell us how it affected them. And so that's a side that they didn't look at. All the people who heretofore had good health insurance that are without it now because you priced them out of the market, trying to give insurance for everybody, with a lot of people freeloading. There is no mandatory verification of your qualifications. That's another problem under Obamacare.
Could you address that, according to the Congressional Budget Office, there will be 23 million more people uninsured in 2026. Could you address this since you brought up that the number of the uninsured has been sort of manipulated?
I'm just back behind you like this. I'm having a difficult time hearing what you're saying.
I brought up the fact that the bill would increase the number of the uninsured by 23 million people. Can you speak about that and whether?
Well, let me tell you about the CBO. What the CBO is not allowed to do is they cannot do dynamic scoring. So they cannot look at the full equation when they do something. They have a one-view approach, and that's the view of the legislation that's written that they're asked to analyze. For example, if I said we're going to lower the cost of Corvettes to $10,000, they would talk about the impact that would have on the economy. They could not dynamic score how many more Corvettes would be sold, and if in fact it would balance.
All right, thank you. Mr. Patel, you have 1 minute. Your thoughts on the bill that was passed by the House in 2017 to repeal the Affordable Care Act.
My opponent and his administration. We are the richest country in the history of the world. They want to remove health care from tens of millions of Americans. Americans don't care about the dynamic scoring of the CBO. They want health care. And your administration and your actions, not only do you want to remove that from tens of millions, these are life and death decisions. People rely on health care. In our district alone, I can't tell you how many folks I've met who are making the challenging decision not to get coverage because they can't afford it. Seniors who are cutting their pills to make them last longer. This is not, we could do so much better. We deserve so much better in this country. And so I will be pushing for Medicare for All to make sure that every single American has health care when they need it.
Mr. Posey, he brought you up, so you have 30 seconds.
The majority of my constituents want health care that's between the patient and the doctor. They don't want a federal bureaucrat in the middle telling them if they're allowed to get the care they need. I read the book of the senator who was the architect of Obamacare and presumably the underwriting of Medicare for All. And his whole idea was to ration care. He said as people get older, they consume too much medical care. That's why they have the IPAP board to ration care so that old people don't get care. They think that's the way we solve the problem.
Thank you. So my next question is for both of you. If you believe the predictions, it seems that Democrats are poised to win back the House of Representatives and Republicans are on the path to maintain the Senate and perhaps even increase their majority. Given that you have a Democratic House, a Republican Senate, and a Republican President, can you two give me one or two things that you think both parties can agree on healthcare reform? And I want you to this to be an exercise of not only bipartisan, but of complete honesty, the things that you truly believe that you can reach across the aisle. And we're going to start with Mr. Patel.
Across our district, regardless of party, the majority of folks are suffering from the same healthcare system. Republicans, Democrats, NPAs. It doesn't matter. Folks, these 100,000 in our district that don't have healthcare span party. And if we look at studies across the United States, even the majority of folks, both Democrat and Republican, agree on a Medicare for All system. I think that we should take this and really bring to the forefront the fact that if the majority of Americans, the majority of constituents in our district want this, we should be able to have representatives, leaders who will have the courage and the will to stand up to the powers that don't want that to happen, be it the insurance industry, be it the drug lobby. And so that's what I'm committed to doing. I'm going to go to Congress and make sure that our folks get health care because that's what they want. That's what they need.
Mr. Posey?
I think both sides agree that they want a better healthcare system. And I think both sides agree that they want to continue to encourage people to go to medical school and become doctors, which has become something of a default in countries where the government has taken over healthcare. That being said, I think both parties truly believe in their heart that they want to do the right thing. There's just two different ways to get there. And one of them is driven by competition, and that's how you force prices down when you have good and free competition. Like I would like to see health care written over state lines so they don't have to have 20 lawyers and 50 lobbyists in every single state. That's a burden that most companies, healthcare companies can't have. And that's one of the answers. But I think both parties want to solve the problem. Both want to keep physicians going to medical school.
Thank you. And I want to move on to the next topic, but healthcare is on the minds of voters in 2018. I want you to very quickly, I'll give you just 30 seconds for this one so we can move on. Where do you stand on these healthcare provisions? Number one, prohibiting health insurance companies from denying coverage for pre-existing conditions. Number two, allowing children to stay on their parents' plan until age 26. Mr. Posey, yes on both or no? Where do you stand on those?
Yes. You know, we had the best healthcare delivery system in the world before Obamacare. We had three problems: adult children that were uninsurable, pre-existing conditions, and companies that dropped you the first time you got sick. And we could solve all three of those with legislation, except the administration did not want to do it. I asked them to do it.
Thank you. Mr. Patel.
I support both, and I have to correct something my opponent said. Before the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, tens of millions of Americans did not have any kind of health insurance.
Thank you. So let's move on to another easy topic.
He mentioned opponents, so let me say.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Having health insurance does not mean you get medical access. A lot of people in Canada, where I would have died if I'd have had my cancer in Canada, they have coverage, they just don't have any access. If you're over 40 and you need an MRI for a brain aneurysm or anything else, you can wait 6, 9 months, maybe a year. They have 6 MRIs per million. We have 24 per million. You have access in this country. You don't have access where the government runs it.
All right. So let's move on to entitlements, another topic that we could spend the whole evening talking about. But my question is, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said that the growth in the nation's national deficit is a result of a bipartisan unwillingness to address spending on Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. So the first part of my question is, do you agree with him? And second, which is the most important part, is name specific changes you would support to make sure entitlement programs remain solvent. And we expect that that Congress will have to do something by around 2033. So time is running out. Mr. Patel, what would you support in terms of changing entitlement programs?
So first, I disagree with Senator McConnell. I think the first thing we have to do is, when they pass that $2 trillion tax cut, the way they're going to pay for that is by cutting Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. Not only do we have to protect these programs that we've worked our whole lives into paying into, we have to make sure that we expand them. Some of the things we can do right off the bat is repeal that $2 trillion tax cut so that we don't have to go after that program. The second thing we can do is lift the cap on Social Security income. Right now, once you get past a certain level of income, they don't take those Social Security taxes. I support raising the cap. You know, my opponent will say he's a champion for seniors. Absolutely not. The Alliance for Retired Americans gave him an 8% rating. They actually endorsed me because I'm going to be protecting Social Security and Medicare.
And yes or no, would you support increasing the retirement age?
No.
Thank you. Mr. Posey?
I think the biggest cost driver is Medicare. And I think one solution is to let seniors who want to opt out of Medicare. A lot of seniors would like to. They're well enough off to provide their own coverage, and they would like to do that. I think we have to be open-minded, obviously, and pragmatic when we have issues come before us. I have never heard anybody mention reducing or changing the structure of Social Security except President Obama when he talked about chaining it. But these rankings that keep getting mentioned are leftist groups. I do pretty good with the rightist groups, and I probably average right in the middle, which is kind of where I think you want to be, kind of pragmatic. I'm not anybody's super duper hero getting 100 year after year after year, and I get the zeros from the leftists, so I probably way out in the middle around the 50s, and I think I'd like to have a congressman like that.
Thank you. So let's move on to the tax reform bill. Mr. Posey, you voted for it. It reduced the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. It increased the child tax credit and gave a tax break to most Americans. The individual tax breaks will expire in 2026, while the business rates will stay in place permanently. My question is, why did you vote for this bill? And could you explain why those tax credits will run out by 2026 for individuals?
Well, first of all, I think they'll be renewed by then. I think I want to see how it works. People talk about lowering the corporate tax rate like these, evil corporations are getting all the benefit, but we did that to make the United States of America more competitive. We had the highest corporate income tax in the world. I mean, I remember growing up, always Sweden had the highest. Sweden's lowered theirs and lowered theirs and lowered theirs because they realized to be competitive in a global market, you have to literally be that. You have to be competitive. And investment money goes where the opportunities are. The president has tried to make sure that we have opportunities in this country, and I'm supporting him in doing that. That's how we have more people be able to afford health care. That's how we have people reach the potential that they have through the opportunity that we give them in this country. And it's done with the free market approach for the most part.
Mr. Patel, 1 minute.
That corporate tax giveaway was shameful. They said, you know what, we're going to see the benefits of that. Instead, what happened was corporations got that tax break, and they used it for stock buybacks, dividends, and what's going to end up happening is, even for those small percentage of folks who were going to get any kind of increase in terms of a reduction in their taxes, we're going to pay on the back end of that. How are we going to pay on the back end of that? Because they're going to cut Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. We've got to put a stop to these elected officials who are in the pockets of big corporations, these special interests that they do their bidding for. My opponent takes all kinds of money. Over the course of 10 years, millions from Big Sugar, big banks, Koch Brothers Industries. And who do you think benefits from that?
Mr. Posey, you have 30 seconds for your rebuttal.
There's so many attacks and not enough time to answer them all. I mean, now, one time you said I took $45,000 in the past 10 years from sugar. Another time you said I took $50,000 from sugar. That's just simply not true. I know you may have read it online, but that doesn't mean it's true. The average of that, I mean, I've sent back more sugar checks than I have received from sugar over the years. So it's just not absolutely accurate at all.
Thank you. So now let's move on to the Mueller investigation. I'm sure there might be some disagreements again. Should Robert Mueller be allowed to continue its investigation into Russia interference in the 2016 elections? Or do you believe, as President Trump has said, quote, that this is a witch hunt? Mr. Patel, you're going first.
Yes, we should continue the investigation. In 2016, we witnessed an attack on our election systems. Our vote is one of our most essential facets of our democracy. And any attack to undermine or subvert that is an attack on our republic. We have to make sure we do a full and thorough investigation, and that is nonpartisan. My opponent actually voted to impeach Attorney General Rod Rosenstein so that they could actually stop that investigation. We need to make sure it comes to a complete, it gets its due process so that we can actually make sure we know what happened. We're looking at Russia trying to undermine our elections this midterm. We've got to preserve and protect our most vital elements of our democracy, and that's our vote.
Thank you. Mr. Posey, should the Mueller investigation continue or not?
I believe the Mueller investigation should run its course. And do I think it's a witch hunt? Yes, I do. But I think it should run its course now that it's started. We do have a deep state. I think everybody knows that. We just don't have local resistors. We have resistors in the deep state. Wrong again about voting to impeach Rosenstein. That never happened. I did sign a letter asking that we charge him. As soon as he began his investigation, I immediately contacted him and said, "What evidence do you have to begin this investigation?" And he refused to answer that question. That's how you get to inference of a witch hunt.
Thank you. There's talk that if Democrats retake the House, they could begin an impeachment process for Justice Kavanaugh for allegedly lying to the Senate. My question is, would you support that, Mr. Posey?
No. Not based on the evidence I've seen. Now, you understand when you have impeachment, it's almost like another trial, so you review all the evidence. But on the evidence I've seen so far, I would not.
Mr. Patel, would you support initiating that process?
I would. When we're talking about a lifetime appointment to one of the most important roles in our country, we have to make absolutely sure that there's no doubt about who we've put into that role. And the investigation, I think it was rushed. I don't believe it was thorough. And so we need to make sure that we take the time to do a full and thorough investigation of that. And if it's deemed that something did come up, at that point we should look at potential impeachment.
All right, so I want to move on now to President Trump. So my first question is for you, Mr. Posey. President Trump has called the congressman, quote, low IQ. He praised a Republican who body slammed a reporter and mocked Christine Blasey Ford, who is Kavanaugh's accuser. His supporters say that he speaks his mind and isn't politically correct, and that's certainly part of his appeal. But do you think the president's comments are appropriate for the office that he holds?
Well, it's not my job to defend any comments that the president makes or that the president tweets. He's elected the president. I'm an elected member of Congress. He doesn't tell me how to behave, and I try not to tell him how to behave. If he does something treasonous or was to violate the office, then it would be my position to do that. But for his social behavior, I don't control over that.
But do you think those comments are appropriate?
I wouldn't do it.
Mr. Patel?
Those comments are 100% inappropriate. You're essentially the president of the United States, the leader of the free world. You have to conduct yourself with a behavior that reflects that. And right now, on the world stage, they mock us. They mock us for those tweets, for those words that he uses. And I think that we should hold our leaders to a higher standard.
Thank you. Mr. Patel, and I have a question for you. If you are elected and if Democrats retake the House, how can you guarantee that your party won't further contribute to the polarization that we see in today's politics? And would you ever support initiating an impeachment process for the president?
So right now, this gridlock essentially is what you're talking about. It's not just in Congress, even within our own families. Families can't have conversations at the dinner table because we have so much division and polarization. And I think that we have too many elected leaders who are stoking it because it keeps this fear of the other side and it keeps them in power. What we need to be able to do is start to have those conversations again. We have real issues that impact all of us. We have to make sure that not only are we talking about them, that we allow differing opinions and voices at the table so that we can actually make meaningful progress on them. In terms of impeachment, I know that there's an ongoing investigation. If it's deemed that our president has done something treasonous or has subverted or undermined our elections process, absolutely, that's on the table. But I'm going to let that investigation play itself out. And until then, we won't make a decision.
Mr. Posey, your thoughts on how Democrats have handled the Trump presidency, and what would you expect if they retake the House?
I missed the last couple words again.
I'm sorry.
Please
speak closer
reel
to the
into your
mic.
mic so I can hear you.
I'm 6 feet tall, so I got to bend over a little bit. So my question is, in reference to the question I've asked to Mr. Patel is, what are your thoughts about how the Democrats have handled the Trump presidency? And if they retake the House, which they seem to be on a pretty feasible path to do, how do you think it's going to be in terms of their relationship with the White House and our polarization that we see in today's politics?
Well, I think it'll be very non-productive, actually, if the Democrats take the House.
Why?
Well, for a number of reasons. People think now that Republicans control the House and the Senate and the Oval Office, but that's not true. The Senate.
All right. This is my last warning. I'm going to ask everyone to be polite and quiet. We do have officers on site. I do not want to be that person who asks them to escort someone out. So please be mindful and respectful of the speakers on stage. Thank you. Please continue.
The reality is now in the Senate, they have what they call the cloture rule. And that means it takes 60 votes to bring most things to the floor of the Senate. They can pass on a majority rule, but you have to have 60 votes to get the bill to the floor. there's 51 Republicans and 49 others. The 49 others lock arms and say, no, we're not going to let you bring it to the floor, and the media accuses us of gridlock. So I don't see a whole lot changing if the Democrats take over the House. It just means probably less stuff will get sent over to the Senate to get gridlocked or hopefully eventually heard.
All right, so let's move on to foreign policy and trade. Simple question. What is your view of the aggressive trade tariffs proposed by the current administration, in particular when it comes to China? Mr. Posey.
I think it's good that he's looking at the trade agreements as he has done. And I think at the end of the day, we're going to be better off. We're going to be treated better by the other countries that we do business with, some of them of which are our adversaries. Believe it or not, some people say that we've become a laughingstock around the world, but I'm here to tell you we've become more respected around the world since this president took office.
And what are your thoughts on the tariffs specifically?
It depends on the tariffs, and he's still in the negotiating process on a lot of the tariffs, so we'll have to wait till it's all finished to be able to judge exactly how well it worked. But I'm in favor of them. I don't think it's fair for a country to charge us an exorbitant tariff and we go lightly on them. That just cost American taxpayers money.
Mr. Patel on tariffs.
These tariffs have adversely impacted small businesses and workers. Right now, we're paying more. I'm meeting small business owners who are severely impacted by these tariffs. The cost of the goods, just take, for example, steel, soybeans. It spans the gamut of every industry. These trade wars are unnecessary, and I'm completely in opposition to these tariffs. And I have to touch on one thing. It's not just, trades, these tariffs that we're impacted by. We're the only country on the planet that hasn't joined the Paris Agreement. So when we talk about foreign policy, whether it be for economic policy, national security, or even just with climate policy, we're falling behind on the international stage, and that's unacceptable.
Thank you. Next question is, our relationship with some of our traditional allies, such as England and Germany, seem to be somewhat precarious because of leaks of confidential information, the withdrawal from the Paris Accord on climate change, and from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. What proposals do you have for renewing or strengthening our ties with allies? Mr. Patel.
We have to earn the trust and respect of our international allies again. When we're talking about climate change, for example, one of the most imminent threats to our planet, we have to address this together with the countries around the world. When we're the only country that hasn't signed on, that doesn't benefit us. I think what we need to do is come to the table and work together to really tackle these issues that will determine the fate of our planet. And so I think that what we need to do is come back to a place where America is at the forefront and says, look, we want to work with you. We're going to innovate. We're going to drive change, and we want to do this together. And I think that's what we need to do.
Mr. Posey?
Well, my mother told me, and I'm sure many of your mothers told you, just because somebody else is jumping off the roof doesn't mean that you have to do it. And I believe that you find in many of these multinational agreements that we have, like the Paris Peace Accord, we end up paying and the others end up playing, just like the UN. We fund almost all the operational costs of the UN, and doggone near every country there is against us on every issue that matters. And so I think we need to have clean air and clean water for the sake of clean air and clean water for our children and our grandchildren. We don't need to do what the French want us to do. We don't need to do what Spain tells us to do. Their ambassador was over to a day of prayer breakfast I was at with the president, and he told us how crazy we were because we weren't doing a cap and trade like they did. I met some Australians a week later. They got elected over cap and trade. They replaced people who were stupid enough to quadruple the price of everybody's gasoline and their electricity on a cap and trade agreement that they said was going to be a neutral cost.
And President Trump has announced his intention to withdraw from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty because he says Russia has violated the agreement. For those who don't know, the agreement prevents the U.S. and Russia from producing cruise missiles with a range of 300 to 3,400 miles. Do you support Trump's decision to withdraw from the agreement?
Yes.
Mr. Posey? Why?
I think he's made a good judgment. I think, we have to hold our friends and foe alike, feet to the fire. If we have an agreement and there's a set of rules and guidelines that we're supposed to operate by, we need to make sure that they're done.
Mr. Patel?
I disagree. These actions are leading us back into a Cold War. What we need to make sure is that when we have an agreement in place, we have to enforce it. But by withdrawing from, when we're talking about nuclear weapons, this is serious. And so I'm in complete disagreement of that, and I think it destabilizes the entire planet.
Thank you. Moving on to Saudi Arabia, another country that's a great ally of the United States. As you have followed in the news, the country has shifted its narrative on what happened to journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who is a known critic of the Crown Prince. After weeks of denying involvement in his disappearance, the Saudi government said he was killed accidentally during a fistfight at their consulate in Istanbul. But Turkish authorities believe a 15-man squad was sent to kill Khashoggi during an appointment at the consulate. Do you believe the Saudi government? And if not, should the U.S. impose sanctions or end its arms deal with that country? Mr. Patel.
What happened to the journalist Khashoggi is horrific and shameful. We have to protect, first off, members of the press. The fact that a journalist can go to another country and that happened to them, and we've seen attacks on journalists across the world, and we can't have that happen. In terms of what happened specifically here with what we're still uncovering the details, and if it is uncovered that, the leadership of Saudi Arabia had active involvement, absolutely. I'd be in support of sanctions or other actions to make sure that those kind of things do not happen. We should not be in partnership with governments that enable that to happen.
Mr. Posey, do you agree the Saudi government on this? And if not, should the U.S. impose sanctions or withdraw from its deal?
First of all the facts are not known. They just aren't known, and I'd prefer not to make a judgment until we knew all of the facts. I just wish that the thousands of Christians who are murdered in the Middle East would get the same amount of media coverage.
All right, thank you. So moving on to the national deficit, certainly has been in the news for the last few days because of a Treasury Department report that said the U.S. deficit grew by $779 billion in Donald Trump's first full fiscal year as president. The agency blames the tax cut package, bipartisan spending increases, and rising interest payments on the national debt. What should Congress do to reduce the national deficit? Mr. Posey.
Well, the best thing Congress could do is what they're doing, following the administration's lead, and that's to create more taxpayers and fewer tax receivers. And the way you do that is by expanding the economy, which is exactly what the president has done. As I said now, for the first time in 30 years, we have more job openings, providing opportunities for people, than we have people looking for work. 2 years ago, when I talked to small businesses throughout my district, and national polls showed the number one concern of every small business in this country was just hanging on and not going out of business, being one more regulation away from being out of business. Today, their number one concern is getting enough qualified employees to meet the demand for their goods and services. That is a wonderful problem to have and a complete paradigm change.
Mr. Patel, what should we do about the national deficit?
First off, we should never measure our economy by the wealth of the 1% or Wall Street, but instead we should do it by the health of our whole community. Right now, nearly 4 in 10 of us here are struggling to meet basic daily needs, things like rent, groceries, healthcare. My opponent, who voted for this $2 trillion tax cut, we're going to have to pay for that. And the way they want to pay for that is by cutting essential programs, things like Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid. It's time that we stop this welfare to the wealthiest and actually make an economy that works for all of us. I met a teacher who, after a full day in the classroom, has to work her second or a third job to make ends meet. When our teachers are having to do that, clearly our economy is not working for all of us.
But specific thoughts on how to reduce the national deficit. I'll get to you, Mr. Posey.
I think the first thing we do is repeal that tax cut.
Thank you. Mr. Posey, your rebuttal.
Well,
you have 30 seconds.
These people are in bad shape. One reason for that is the bad economy that we've had for 8 years and no effort to expand the economy or create more jobs and opportunity for people. The tax cuts have made that possible, and that's a reality. 3 ways that people get through life if they're not independently wealthy. They work, they steal, or they're on welfare. And if you don't have jobs for people, they only have 2 options, and we don't like those. So we must provide jobs for people. That's the linchpin of a civil society, to provide for the environmental, the educational, et cetera, that we want.
Thank you. And moving on to gun control, my question is, do you support any regulation on gun ownership, such as stronger background checks, age restrictions on ownership by those with a mental history of violence and or mental illness? Would you support any sort of restrictions on gun ownership? Mr. Patel, you're going first.
Sure. So we've all been heartbroken by Pulse, Parkland. We see these tragedies over and over again. And we're all frustrated by lack of any progress on meaningful gun reform legislation in this country. I believe there are common sense things we can do. Let's make sure that we do have universal background checks. The majority of Americans support that. Let's make sure that weapons don't end up into the hands of those who shouldn't have them. When we talk about mental health here in this country, let's make sure that it's actually more accessible and affordable than getting a weapon. So there's a lot that Americans agree on, and I think that we should be looking at passing this legislation.
Mr. Posey?
The state legislature, the Florida legislature, and Congress combined have made about 2 dozen changes to the law. They've done such things as increase the age to buy weapons. Both of them have funded more money for mental health. As he pointed out, that certainly needs to be done. They've also appropriated money and plans for defense mechanisms for schools, that they have to have drills, they have to know how a crisis operates. There's hotlines so people can report those who might be a threat to a school. There's also better funding and a better direct line for transmitting information about people who should not have weapons to the national database. We've had a complete meltdown and failure of that component in the past.
Thank you. Now, I want to move on to elections. What efforts do you support to protect our election systems from hacking and other external threats, especially by foreign actors? Mr. Posey, you're going first.
Well, I wrote the Election Reform Act after the Bush-Gore fiasco in 2000, and it passed unanimously, by the way. Every Democrat voted for it, even after that contentious election. And I made it pretty bulletproof. And actually, they said it would probably cost Republicans 100,000 votes statewide to have precinct-based optical scanners, which I required. After I left, the Secretary of State allowed the touchscreens, which are vulnerable and did not have a paper trail. I think we should not allow the touchscreens. I know the reasons for them. I know that in some counties they have to print ballots in 80 languages, but so be it. Print hard ballots in 80 languages. But I think our vulnerabilities with the touchscreens, I think with the precinct-based optical scanners, it's bulletproof, a manual recount. You don't worry about chads. It's about as bulletproof as you can get.
Mr. Patel, on protecting our election system.
So in 2016, we witnessed a hostile foreign actor interfere with our elections process. We have to elect leaders in Congress who are going to stand up and defend our voting systems, our democracy. You know, my opponent didn't even agree that Russia hacked into our elections. You know, we have to elect leaders who understand the technology as well. The systems that control our bank accounts, our social security numbers, our votes. He actually voted against a measure to provide additional funding for cybersecurity and for protecting our election systems. We have to elect leaders who will make that a priority.
Mr. Posey, you have 30 seconds. Do you believe that Russia interfered in our elections?
I believe Russia tried, but report after report has said they were not effective, and they did not. They did not affect the outcome of our election. And I have voted against appropriations where they doubled up and they're more than the agency asked for or more than the agency could reasonably spend. People do some of those amendments sometimes just so they can say, you voted against an amendment to protect elections. It's, again, the left wing.
Thank you. And my next question, I think you're going to have fun with it. So I'm going to ask Mr. Patel to name one thing that you agree with President Trump on, and I'm going to ask Mr. Posey to name one thing that you disagree with the president. Mr. Patel. We have less than 5 minutes left. So.
One thing that I agree with him on. You know what I will say? He was in opposition of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I also was in opposition to that because I think it was a backroom deal that we didn't really have all the information about. So I would say that was one thing I would agree with him on.
Thank you. Mr. Posey, one thing you disagree with President Trump on?
Yeah, and for the record, I voted against the TTP each time. I even voted against the rule, which you're never supposed to vote against your party's rule. I voted against the rule for TTP. I was so adamantly against it. I disagree with him tweeting about Rosie O'Donnell. I don't think the public cares about that. And
well, thank you. Thank you for giving honest and heartfelt answers to my question. We have less than 3 minutes left, so we're going to move on to our closing statements. And Mr. Posey, you're going first. You have 1 minute for your closing statement.
I'm just sad we didn't have time to talk about so many other issues that are important to my constituents, such as the economy. We didn't get to talk enough, actually, about the economy, about America's space program, which is now on track to be #1 in the world again, finally, about Veterans Affairs, about national defense. We passed the National Defense Authorization Act, and we are finally rebuilding our military. We're giving our men and women in uniform the tools they need to protect us and protect our freedom. We also gave them the largest pay increase they've had in 9 years. They kind of like that. We've also this year gone to a rule that I passed, which requires members and the public to have at least 3 days to review legislation before we're asked to vote on it, and another rule that I passed that says it has to be in a form that you can actually tell what it says when you got to vote on it. So, I think those are important issues to people who work hard and play by the rules, and I think it's clear that if you want less government, less taxes, more freedom, you vote for Bill Posey. Thank you. God bless you and God bless America.
Mr. Patel, we're running out of time. Thank you.
In many ways, our district, where men and women are literally launched to the stars, it represents the dream of every American and what we're capable of when we all stand together. If we can reach the moon and soon Mars, surely we can come together to make sure that everyone has health care in this country, that hardworking people earn livable wages, that every kid can go to college or trade school without a lifetime of debt. If we can reach other planets, surely we can come together to take care of the one planet we call home. As I stand here before you, an immigrant to this country whose parents had the courage to come here in search of a better future for our family, I'm going to ask you for that same courage, the courage to dream of and create a better future for all of us. We can take care of each other. We can build a better country, and we can make sure that our government works for all of us. My name is Sanjay Patel, and I would be so honored to earn your vote this November.
Thank you. This is a wrap-up for our forum series here on WEFS. My thanks again to the candidates. And remember, Election Day is November 6th. Thank you for watching.